In this lesson, we're going to take a look at a vulnerability scan report. Now, a vulnerability scan report is going to be produced by the system automatically once you finish doing your vulnerability scan. Now, generally, you're not just going to take this scan and turn it into your boss, though. You need to actually do some analysis on it to determine, are these things right? Whenever you do a vulnerability scan, for each of these vulnerabilities, you need to look at them and determine if they were detected by the scanner, do they really exist in your system? Because just because the scanner says they're there doesn't mean they're actually there. Sometimes we'll have false positives. For example, I've run scans and I'll get things saying that I'm vulnerable to an exploit because I'm missing a critical Windows patch, even though I'm running a Mac or a Linux system. So that's one of the reasons why it's so important to go through your vulnerability scan reports and look at each identified vulnerability, determine does it exist on your system, and if it does, how severe is it, and how critical is it for you to get it fixed. Then you create your plan of action and milestones, and you start remediating those things. Now, when you look at a vulnerability scan report, generally, it's going to take a format that's similar to this. Most tools will have a more graphical type format where they'll use color coding to show you what is critical, high, medium, low, or informational. But at the end of the day, what we're looking at is the information, not the format here. The same information that's on this report will be on most other scanning tools, regardless of if you're using Nessus, OpenVAS, QualsGuard, or any of the other vulnerability scanners out there. It really doesn't matter. They're all going to have basically the same types of information. Now, in general, you're going to have your vulnerability scan report start out with the report ID, the scan date and time, what system or version of software and definitions were used to conduct that scan, and then the name of the person who ran those scans. Then you'll have a short summary that's usually going to be called an executive summary. If you're running a vulnerability scan across a large network that has hundreds or thousands of hosts, you may end up having hundreds or thousands or even hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, and none of your executives want to look through that level of detail. So instead, you're going to summarize it as a cybersecurity analyst or cybersecurity professional to tell them what kind of themes and trends you're seeing. For example, if you were scanning a network of 100 computers and 50 of them are missing a patch that was released 5 years ago, that tells you have a patch management problem in that organization, and you need to highlight that inside the executive summary. Next, you're going to have all of your vulnerabilities listed, and generally they're going to list these from critical to high to medium to low and then to informational. Or you can also run these based on hosts. So you can actually run the scan across 100 machines and then have the report show you which is the most vulnerable host. Maybe you had one host that's missing 50 patches, and you have other hosts that are missing only one patch. So we would have the most critical or most vulnerable host at the top, and then work our way down the list to help us with our prioritization efforts. Now, as we go through this report, we're going to take a look at these different vulnerabilities and discuss them a little bit. Now, when you look at this is a very generic style report. Under the high severity vulnerabilities, the first thing we're going to see is our vulnerability ID. And you'll notice it starts with CVE. That is a common vulnerability and exposure. Then -2021, which was the year it was released, and then -34523, which was the 34,523rd vulnerability released in 2021. The name of this vulnerability is CVE-2021-34523. But to make it easier for us to understand what it is, there's also a description. This is a Microsoft Exchange Server remote code execution vulnerability. The effective system was the Exchange Server 01.domain.local, and the impact is it allows an authenticated attacker to perform a remote code execution. Now, this CVSS score, or the Common Vulnerability Scoring System score, is actually listed as a 9.1, which is a very high score because the top score is a 10 and the lowest score is a 0. The remediation that they recommend is to apply the update provided by Microsoft in the security bulletin MS21-087. So what this is telling me is we have a known vulnerability on our Microsoft Exchange server. That's the bad news. But the good news is there's an easy fix. We can install this update, which is a hot fix called MS21-087. So if we go to Microsoft's website, we download it and we install it on the Exchange server, this will solve this issue. So we can do that, and then we could rescan the system, and we should see that vulnerability go away because we've now patched that vulnerability. The next vulnerability we have is CVE-2022-21882, and this is a Windows Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP, remote code execution. The affected system is a desktop number 152 and desktop 178. This particular vulnerability will allow an unauthenticated attacker to connect via RDP and execute arbitrary code. The remediation is to install the latest Windows security update and disable RDP if it's not required. Now, in this case, we actually have two different recommendations here. One is to install a security patch, and the second one is to disable RDP. So if these computers don't need RDP, we don't even need to worry about the security patch because we can just disable RDP, and therefore it's no longer going to be applicable to us. But if we actually need to allow RDP to remain open and available because our service desk likes to connect into these desktops to be able to remotely support them, then we're going to have to update that security patch to make sure that it is no longer vulnerable. The other thing I want to point out between these two vulnerabilities is the first one we talked about said that it allowed an authenticated attacker, which means that person has to be an insider threat or have access to credentials for your organization. But the second one is an unauthenticated attacker, which means anybody, whether they're logged in or not, would be able to connect over RDP with this vulnerability if they're throwing the right exploit. And that's why this is actually more severe. Now, if it's more severe, why is the CVSS score lower? Well, it's because of what it's impacting. When you're dealing with RDP, specifically on these desktops, we are only dealing with a single workstation. But when we're dealing with an Exchange server, it's serving everybody's email across the entire organization, so it is going to have a higher CVSS score, and the way it attacks and the ability you have once that attack is successful will be more impactful, and that's another reason why the CVSS score is higher. The next one we have is a medium severity vulnerability that's called CVE-2021-25646, and this is an Apache Druid remote code execution. Here, the affected system is our analytics server number 3, and the attacker can send a specifically crafted request to execute arbitrary code. Now, because it is a specifically crafted request and it's harder to execute, it's only going to have a CVSS score of 6.5. The remediation to solve this vulnerability is pretty easy. We're going to install the latest version of Apache Druid to address the vulnerability. Now, unfortunately, if there was no updated version available yet, we wouldn't be able to do that, or maybe we're running this on an older server that can't support the latest version. In those cases, we'd have to come up with compensating controls or other mitigations to be able to address this vulnerability instead of just updating it to the latest version. Now, when you're analyzing these things as a cybersecurity professional, it's important to be able to look up those CVEs on the CVE website. If you go to cve.org and type in that CVE number, you'll be able to get pages of information about these vulnerabilities, how they work, how they're exploited, and different mitigations you can use to overcome them. So keep that in mind as well. If we move on to our second page, we'll see we have 2 more vulnerabilities to look at. The first one is number 4, which is vulnerability CVE-2022-22965, which is the Spring Framework RCE via data binding on JDK 9+. The affected system here is our web application server, and it allows the attackers to use crafted data to bind expressions to execute arbitrary code. Here, we have a CVSS score of 5.3. This is why it's a medium, because it's a lower priority for us and a lower criticality. The reason is, this allows you to execute arbitrary code, but it is not a remote code execution, which means they have to be physically present on the network to be able to access this and be able to send this crafted packet. So, in this case, we would remediate this by simply updating the Spring Framework version to one that has fixed this vulnerability. The last vulnerability we have is vulnerability CVE-2021-44228, and the description here is an Apache log4j remote code execution vulnerability, which is known as log4 shell. This affects our legacy server, which is an older server. It is a remote code execution in an application that uses log4j, so it only affects very few applications and only the ones using log4j. And this makes it have a much lower CVSS score, and it's down to a 3.7, and you'll see in parentheses, it was mitigated by network controls, which means we might have things in place that are blocking people from accessing this server, and it's in an isolated area of our network, and that reason makes it a much lower CVSS score because it is not as important or not as critical at a high or medium level because it is in this network isolated state. To be able to remediate this CVE, you're going to update to log4j version 2.15.0 or higher, and that will solve this vulnerability. Now, after that, you'll have some additional findings. This may be all of your informational findings, and in this case, we had a minor vulnerability related to some outdated SSL certificates, unused services running on several machines, and misconfigured server headers. In our real scanning report, if you went to a detailed report, we would see all of those listed out with which machines, which IP addresses, and which pieces of software were being misconfigured on these different servers. But because this is a summary report, we're not seeing that. And then finally, we have some recommendations, which includes prioritize patching of high severity vulnerabilities immediately, reviewing your medium severity issues and scheduling patching in the next maintenance window, and then addressing low severity issues per your standard patch cycle or when your resources allow. Our conclusion is going to summarize the actions we've taken and what recommendations we have. And in this case, it's going to say the identified vulnerabilities pose varying levels of risk to our network. The high and medium severity issues require prompt action, and continued vigilance and regular scanning are recommended to maintain the security posture. This is the idea of what a basic vulnerability scan report looks like, and I will tell you, this one is a very simplified version. You saw this was only on 2 pages, and it was covering an entire network. But normally when I run this across an entire network, I will have 50, 100, or even 500 pages of data coming back to me with all the details of every vulnerability, all the criticalities, all the impacts, and all the remediation actions that we can take to improve the security of our network. The bottom line here is when you're dealing with a vulnerability scan report, you need to take the time to look at it and not just accept what they told you was high, medium, and low, because what that automatic tool tells you is what is known in the common database based on the CVE posture or CVSS score. The problem with that is you may have mitigations in place that these systems don't realize. And because of that, you have to take that into account and then mitigate these things. For example, if I go back to the first page and we had that high vulnerability for the Exchange server. Well, if I know that the Exchange server is actually being decommissioned tomorrow because we're going from Exchange Server 2016 to a modern Exchange server, that would tell us that vulnerability is going to go away anyway. So we probably don't have to remediate it here on the scan report, and it's not nearly as high or critical for us as it would be if we're going to be stuck with this server for another 6 months or a year. And so these are the things that you have to know your organization and your network to understand the impact and the prioritization that needs to occur for those vulnerabilities that you find inside of your vulnerability scan reports.